So now that we have experimented with some of the features of Illustrator and investigated some of the differences that it has with Photoshop, we can now start to look on the exercise. So we are going to actually delete all of this stuff here by just selecting all of them. We're going to hit delete. So we're now at a blank artboard once again. Now we're also going to reset our colors here, and remember we can do that by actually clicking this little icon here, just like Photoshop. So we click this here and then it will reset to the default. Now let us take a look on the exercise. Now the objective is that we want to convert this sketch to digital line work. And there are many uses of this, especially in architecture, because, you know, diagramming is one of the ways that as designers we communicate. Now, when a diagram is in vector, it has way more flexibility, as you can move arrows around and change thickness of lines and all of these things. And in sometimes you might have a little diagram that you have created, but you want to put it in Illustrator so you can further expand on that diagram, especially if you want to include it on your sheet as a part of your presentation. So we're going to access the original sketch here by using our accessing our exercise files, and our original sketch will look something like this. Now, of course, this is an image, which is pixels. So we're going to download this image here. And that image is now in my downloads. And I can actually drag that image onto my artboard like that. And that's the image. Now, one interesting thing to note is that, yes, Illustrator is a vector editing program, but you're able to actually drag images into Illustrator. And if you look here, you can clearly see that this is not vector work, it's pixels, because you can see the pixels here. But it is still able to be shown in Illustrator. Now, another thing to notice is, if you remember, this symbol here with the X, it's very similar to the symbol in Photoshop, where an object is a smart object, meaning that it can't be manipulated in any way. Now, this symbol here has pretty much the same meaning. However, no pixel work can be manipulated in Illustrator, meaning that you can't erase these pixels. You can't use like a paint bucket and fill this area here. And that's because Illustrator does not recognize pixels. Photoshop would be the application that's able to manipulate pixels or edit them. In Illustrator, you cannot manipulate them any at all. So what Illustrator actually does, it creates a link to the original file. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you look here in my downloads, you can see where I have this original file here, which is called Sketch. Now, if I delete this file, then what will happen is in Illustrator, I will get a message to say, hey, that media is missing. And that's because Illustrator has not embedded the image, but yet rather it has created a link directly to the image. So hence I'm going to now lose this image here. So let me choose no. All right, great. Now I'm going to delete this image, and let's go back and grab my image from my desktop. So I'm going to actually grab back this image now and drag it back there. Now the image is going to be linked. Now remember how Illustrator works. Anything you click on, the properties for whatever you click on is located up here. And these are just a collection of common properties. If we really wanted to get down and dirty with having more options, we would use our panels here, which has way more options. But right away, we can see that over here that these are the options that Illustrator has for this that's selected. Now notice the name of the object that we have here. It's called linked file. It is located on layer 1, which is located here. And I can choose to embed it. I can edit original, or I can do an image trace. I can do mask, and all these other properties that is located up here are all related to this object that I have selected down here. Now, what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to embed this image. Now, once the image is embedded, then it is no longer linked. So if I go to my desktop now, where I had the sketch image here, and I delete it, then notice that nothing happens to my Illustrator. It is still there, and that is because this image is now embedded into the file rather than being referenced or linked to the original file. And that might be a good thing or bad thing depending on how you want to work. Okay, good. So once the file is embedded, using my selection tool, I'm going to resize this. Now you might want to hold shift, because if you don't, then the image will be squashed. So we don't want to squash the image. So we're going to resize this and place it up here, and we're going to pretty much try to use as much as the page as possible. Let's kind of zoom out there like that. There we go. Let's put it in the center of the page here. Okay, good. There we go. All right, good. So while it is there in the center of the page, we're going to now put this on a new layer before we start tracing. So what we're going to do is create a new layer, and that is on the same location as Photoshop. So that is down here, and we're going to create a new layer. So notice the new layer is created here. It's called layer 2, and what we're going to do is name this layer. We're going to call this original sketch. Then we want to place our object on that layer. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag this object into this layer here. So we're going to drag that and release. So now if we expand original sketch, you will see that the image is now underneath that layer called original sketch. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually select this layer. Let's click on the object, and we're going to use our control panel at the top, and we're going to change the opacity of this. Let's change it to about 30. And then notice that it gets much paler. And we're doing this because we want to now trace on top of this now, to trace this line work as vector, so that we are able to manipulate the vector. As this is now, this is this is pixels, so it would be very difficult to manipulate this. You can't change the arrow or change the direction of the arrow because these are all pixels. So this is a reason why in architecture you might want to trace something in order to manipulate it better as vector. So what we're going to do is we're going to lock that layer by clicking the lock symbol here. And that will now prevent this layer from being selected and moved or anything. Alright, great. So now we're going to create another new layer. So we're going to go back to our new layer icon here. And we're going to call this new layer our trace layer. And of course, this layer needs to be on top of our original sketch layer. And it does not need to be locked because we're going to be needing to manipulate this layer. Our original layer here, we can actually just dump that and delete that layer. So now at the end of the day, we should end up with two layers, our original layer and our trace layer here. Alright, so if I zoom in here now, I can clearly see what I will have to sketch. Now I can see that this area is hatched. I can see that there are different types of arrows, and I can see that this is kind of like a fill with dots, maybe representing ground or sand or earth, and then this is perhaps representing maybe the edge of trees or water. We see some arrows representing views. So this is a pretty standard concept sketch that you might choose to do in your architectural design. Now, to get started to digitize this sketch, we got to ensure that we're on the sketch layer, and we need to select our pen tool, which is located here. Alright, so when we choose the pen tool, we're going to use the pen tool to pretty much take care of most geometric shapes. So for example, this building here. Now before we start drawing, we want to ensure that the fill color of our pen, our pen tool, is transparent, and we want the stroke color to be black. And we do want it to be black and a little thick, because as you can see, the line work here is quite black and quite thick. So in order to do that, we need to select the fill, and then we want to say for this fill, we want it to be nil. So we're going to choose that option, and that makes it no fill. Then now we need to select the stroke now, which is here, and notice that it's kind of behind the fill. So you need to activate it by clicking once on the stroke here. Notice that it is now on top of the fill. Now what color do you want the stroke to be? Now in this case we want to make it black. Now black isn't in this quick access menu here, so we're going to use our we could either use our color panel here to determine the color. And remember, we expanded the color panel by using the panel options, or we could just use our control bar up top. So usually you'd use the color panel when you want to get really specific, like what color of cyan and magenta, you want to include specifically. But in this case, we want to make it just straight black. So we can just really get away by choosing this down arrow here and choosing black. Oops, actually, wait. That actually changed the fill, my bad. So you want to choose a stroke and choose black. There we go. All right. Now we're ready to draw. So we're going to, with the pen tool selected, we're going to click once, click again, click once, click again, and you get the rough idea. You're pretty much tracing this thing here. Now, this is a sketch, so don't worry about those parts that are extending beyond the sketch. For this purpose, we just want to digitize this. Now that we have drawn it, we do need to we do need to make this line work bigger. Oh, notice that I didn't actually close my line work. And in case you did this, you need to go back to your pen tool, hover over the last area you did, and notice you get a little line there, symbol on the pen tool. You're going to click once, release, and then click again, and then that will close it off, just in case some of you did not close the loop. Now next, what we want to do is increase the width of this line. So we could actually just select this here and use our stroke here. That looks like about it. Now another thing you might do is you know, notice how the original line work didn't really have these really sharp, you know, corners like a razor blade. These are looking quite sharp. So ideally you'd want to round those up. Now the option to do that is definitely not going to be in our control panel here. So we need to go to do we need to go and do the heavy lifting, and that is located on your stroke panel here, because on the stroke panel you would now be able to change a whole lot more options relating to this line that you see here. So what we're gonna do is we are gonna change the corners to curved corners, and notice how the corners that you see here are now nicely curved. There we go. You can see them curved now, which is a better kind of interpretation, I think, for this in this case. Okay, now once we have this drawn up now, we might realize that the pen tool is great for drawing angular line work. Now we do want to use our curvature tool. Now I'm hoping that you would have the curvature tool. It was introduced somewhere in perhaps Illustrator version CS6 and upwards. Don't quote me on that, but it wasn't always there in Illustrator. But I'm going to assume that most of us have this option here. So we're going to use the pen curvature tool this time to get this area here, which kind of represents a more organic shape. So with that tool selected, we're going to click once, click again, and notice as you draw that the program kind of does most of the curve work for you, and it takes some getting used to, but you will get the hang of it. You might have to draw it once or twice. If you make a mistake, you just need to Control Z to undo. Now once you draw the curvature tool, we need to perhaps edit it. I think the line work is a bit thick, so with our selection tool we want to select the line work, and we're going to use our stroke panel and make that stroke a little smaller. Then we're going to actually use our direct selection tool to try and neat up our line. So chances are when most of you drew your line work, maybe you had some kinks in it. You know, it wasn't nice and smooth following the sketch. So don't worry about it and don't try to get it on the first go. What you need to do is to just draw the closest thing that you can manage to draw to it, and then you manipulate it when you're done. So now that you're finished drawing the closest that you can get to your sketch, you're going to use the direct selection tool now, which is this one. And remember from earlier, our direct selection tool allows us to now go in and manipulate these anchor points individually. So now we're able to manipulate these points. Now remember how you manipulate these points is by first clicking on the point you want to manipulate. Click on it once. Don't try and click and move it. Just click on it once first, then click and drag it into place. So in this case, maybe this kink here was a bit much, so I'm going to click on this, and then I'm going to adjust this handle to just kind of meet that there, and I'm going to click on this one and adjust this handle. Now, dealing with curves is something that takes practice. You may not necessarily get it on the first go, but manipulating these, they're called Bezier curves, is quite a skill that you develop after doing a lot of line work for a while. So that's our first curved line work there. So I'm going to hold shift and pan over here. Now here's another one here. So let's try and get this in. Now I'm going to use a different technique to get this kind of line work in. What I'm going to do this time is I'm going to use my pen tool actually. And I'm going to use the pen tool and I'm going to draw a rough estimation of what this curvature is. Now, obviously that is not accurate because you can clearly see below that these are curved. But this time around, I'm now going to go to my direct selection tool and I'm going to select this angled point here, and I can do one of two things. I can, with this point selected, I can now go up to my control menu and I can change that point to a curve. So I'm going to do that by clicking there. There we go. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to select this point, and this time let me try using this curve feature here. So you realize there are many ways that you could achieve this. Let me use the curve feature here again. There we go. And I think that will about do it. Now I probably want to pull this back a bit. So in order to do this, what I'm going to do is using my direct selection tool, I'm going to select this point. I'm going to hold shift and select the next point, and then I'm going to drag it to kind of move it in place. Select the point, then move it. Don't try and select the point and dragging it. Chances are you'll drag the entire object. Click the point first, then click and hold again and move it. Click the point first, then click and move it. So that takes a bit of practice, but if you follow this method, you won't run into any annoyances. All right, so that is pretty much the most of the drawing sketched. So now we get the idea of how to do this artwork. So let's get this other one on the roll here. So we're going to choose our line tool. Now in this case, I already know that I want to make this the same thickness as this. So what I could do as a kind of a shortcut is that I could use my selection tool and I could use my pen tool and draw first. Now I am a fan of drawing it rough first and then adding in the curves afterwards. There we go. Now obviously this area should be curved, so I'm going to just go for my direct selection tool, click this area here, and I'm just going to use this smooth feature to just smooth that out for me. Now notice that, okay, this line should be as thick as this line. You can clearly see that there are two different thicknesses. Now instead of, adjusting the thickness here, I am going to use the opportunity to introduce our pipette tool, which is here. Now Photoshop also has a pipette tool, and what the pipette tool does, it's kind of like it mimics the properties of a selected object. So what you're going to do is I'm going to use my my selection tool. I'm going to click this line here. Then I'm going to go for my pipette tool and click the thicker line here. And notice what it did? It pipette the features of this line onto this line. So that's another interesting thing that you can do as well. All right, great. So let's draw this last point in again. And for this one, I think I can use my curvature tool. So I'm going to use my curvature tool to get this line work in. There we go. And I think that's okay for now. I can use my direct selection tool to maybe move stuff around if I think that it doesn't quite matches. And of course, I'm going to use my pipette tool again. So I'm going to click this object first with my selection tool. So let's use the selection tool. Click this object. Then I'm going to go for my pipette tool and click this object. And then it will match those two together. All right, now we can actually start to see our sketch coming together. And we can now add these arrows. Now, to let this be a little more organized, I want us to start putting our objects on different layers. So right now, everything was on the trace layer. But now, what I want us to do is to create multiple layers just to help us to keep organized. So what we're going to do is we're going to click the new layer button here. And we're going to create a new layer. We're going to call this maybe ground. And let's create another new layer and call it building. And let's create another one and maybe call it arrows. Great. Now all we need to do is to put the right stuff on the right layer. So if we extend this down, we can see like a preview of these elements here. Now what you might notice is that you might say, well, there's no way for me to tell, you know, what object is what. You know, it does gives you a little preview, so maybe you're not able to recognize the objects. Well, what you could do is instead of selecting the objects here, you could select the objects from here by clicking this little dot here. So when I click this, I know that I'm selecting that, and that is a part of the ground. So I'll drag this to the ground layer. Undo. Let me do that again. Select that there and drag this to the ground layer. Good. When I select this one, I can see that that's the building here. So I'm going to drag this to the building layer. And I'm basically going to do the same thing again. I'm going to drag this to the ground layer. Oops. Make sure you drag the object and not the layer. So I'm going to drag this to the ground layer. You have to click on this circle to get it highlighted. Drag that to the ground layer, and this is the last one here. I'll drag this to the building layer. There we go. All right, good. Now let us get this curved line in, and this should be pretty straightforward. We probably can use the curvature tool, and let us go on the ground layer before drawing this, and we're going to use the curvature tool and just kind of, you know, just kind of get this curve in. This is obviously representing something like water or something organic, so we don't need to worry too much about that accuracy. Now to finish, I'm going to press escape, and I'm going to draw another one here. And notice that these lines are a bit too thick, so this time I'm going to select both of these lines, and I'm going to use the stroke panel and change the stroke thickness. There we go. All right. Now we get into the arrows. So let's go on our arrow layer. Now, in order to draw these arrows, we're going to actually use an arrow tool. Now, we are not going to trace and create manual arrows. Illustrator has a very robust set of arrowing tools that we can use for diagrams. So let us investigate those options. Now, to do this, let us use our curvature tool since the arrows are curved. And we're going to draw this one first. So I'm going to start here and kind of click and kind of just get that curve going like that. Press escape. All right. Now that I've drawn the arrow there, I now need to put on the arrowheads. Well, let's increase the thickness. Now this is where our stroke panel is going to come in very handy. So I need to increase the thickness of this line just a bit. Then I would need to use the arrowhead feature, which is located here under the stroke panel. So I'm going to add an arrow that looks maybe like that on one end. Let's use a different arrow. What about this one? Yeah, that one looks closer. And I'm going to add another arrow there on the other end. Now what I can do is I can change the scale of the arrow. So notice this arrow is actually a bit bigger. And how I'm changing the scale, I'm actually clicking in here and using the mouse wheel. And you can see the size of the arrow increasing there. Then I can use the direct selection tool and click at the tip here and just kind of get this arrow where it should be. And I'll do the same for that arrow. And this is great because you realize that you can really just edit these arrows anytime. So let's follow that up again. So let's do another arrow that goes this way. So we're going to use, make sure that you're on the arrow layer, and we're going to use the curvature tool again, and we're going to start here and just kind of sketch this, and we're going to end that one here. Oops. Now notice that it did that because it was trying to intersect two different lines, which you can't just join. So when you're doing this, what I would suggest is to stop just short of the line there. Press escape and then use your direct selection tool to kind of drag it down a little bit like that. There we go. Now again, we can use the same trick. We can click on this line. We can use our pipette tool and grab the arrow from this line here. Of course, it's going to grab both ends because the line has both arrows. So what we would need to do is to click on this line here and say, for this end, we want no arrows. Now here's an interesting one here. This one has a dashed line. Now to get this arrow going, we would do the same thing. We would start up here. This is a straight line, so I would start here. Now notice I'm not trying to start here, because if I start here, what it's going to do is extend this line. I'm going to start up here and come down like that. And notice I just stop short of it because I don't want Illustrator to join these two lines together. So I'm going to use my direct selection tool, drag that down like that, and then I'm going to perhaps use my arrow tool. Yeah, I think I'll do that. I'll use my pipette tool and see if I could grab the arrow there. There we go. And then maybe I'll just align this a little better like that. Alright, now with this arrow selected, I'm going to now use my dash line feature, which is here. And what this will do is it will create a dash line for me. Oh, let's select the line first and then enable the dash line feature like that. And I'm using the mouse wheel now to change the size of these dashes. So let's make it like that. And I can actually go in this next box here and change the distance between the dashes like that. There we go. When you change the distance here, sometimes it gets a little funny here. You need to click. You need to press enter. There. Sometimes the mouse wheel doesn't work with this, so I'm just going to type it in 5 and enter. There we go. Now here comes a little interesting part here. Now this arrow actually has, it's actually empty here. And of course Illustrator doesn't have a empty kind of head arrow like that. So instead, what we would need to do is we would need to use a feature of Illustrator called Create Outlines to turn this line into an outline, which basically outlines this shape here. And then we can now allow this arrow to be empty inside. So let's investigate how we would do that. Now, perhaps, let's see, we might want to, let's do it this way. We're going to go to Object. We're going to go to Expand Appearance. And what this has now done is it has now turned the arrow, here we go, into a shape. As you can see there. Now this is still a line, but this is now a shape. And notice that I'm using the direct selection tool to be able to select them separately. Now why do I do that? Well, let's use the selection tool and click on it. Now notice when I click on it, the entire line selects. I don't get the option to select just the arrowhead, and this is because this is a group. So when I use the Create Outlines feature, it created a group. It created one object with the arrowhead, and then it created another object with the dash lines, and it grouped them together for me. Now, if I want to be able to select just the arrowhead here, I would have to use my direct selection tool, which allows me to click on the elements that make up this group, or I could actually right click and say ungroup. So I'm going to ungroup that. So now I'm able to select these two objects separately. Now what I want to do here is I want to change this, because this is saying that my fill is black and my stroke is none. But if you look on this arrow in the background, it has a stroke and the fill is actually, well, white. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to now swap this around by pressing this button here. So now the fill is empty and the stroke is black, but we don't want the fill to be empty. We actually want the fill to be white. So we're going to choose that. And let's go to the color panel here, and we're going to choose white. Then we're going to go to the fill, to the stroke, and go to our stroke panel and increase the width of the stroke like that. That's good enough. There we go. And if we really wanted to like manipulate the arrows, we could use the direct selection tool and do that. But the objective of this is not to trace exactly what we see, but rather to digitize this diagram here. And I think we have accomplished most of that. Now these arrows are going to be very easy to do. Essentially all they are lines. So what we could actually do is, well, let's make sure that we say no fill and black stroke, and we're going to draw one of these lines. Let's start here. Let's draw the line like that. And then we can just go to our stroke panel and say, let's give it an arrowhead. Oops, it's turned the wrong way, so we can actually use the flip icon there, and we can flip that around like that. Now we can simply copy this now by, we can do it the traditional way. Go to edit, go to copy, and go back to edit and go to paste. Notice you see another one there. I can use my move tool and move it. But a shorter way to do this would be to hold Alt and try to move the arrow, and it will just create a copy. These are slightly angled, so I'm going to use my direct selection tool and kind of angle them a little bit like that. There we go. All right. So now we've pretty much have most of the line work done. So what we want to do now is to fill in some patterns. Now I say patterns because I don't expect anybody to manually draw in these lines, just like how I didn't expect anybody to manually draw arrowhead lines as well. Illustrator, as I said, it's the king of line work. So things like patterns and arrows and line work, they usually have a tool that's already dedicated to do just that. Now, in order to in order to get going with putting in the patterns, we need a new panel to do this, and this panel is called our swatches panel. So we're going to turn that on. You might remember Photoshop also had a swatches panel. However, Illustrator swatches panel, I would say, is a little bit more robust than Photoshop swatches panel. That might be, you know, that's an opinion. But the swatches panel essentially gives us pre-made colors, patterns, and textures that we can use for either the fill or the stroke of a vector artwork. So what we're going to do is we're going to dock this right along here. So we're going to drag here and drag it up there like that. Good. So we can have it, the options up top. Now, in order to access the library for different patterns, we need to click the library icon, not to be confused with the library panel. This library option here is only found under the swatches panel. So you need to open swatches first and then go to the library option. So we're going to click the library icon here. We're going to go down to patterns, basic graphics, and then we're going to go to basic graphic lines. And we're going to pick that. And notice it opens up this library category here of lines. Now, before we get going, what we have to do first is we need to designate the object we want to apply this to. So with our selection tool, let's select this object here. Then we want to affect the fill, not the stroke. So we want to ensure that the fill is actually selected. Currently the fill is nothing, so we want to choose the fill. Then we want to choose a pattern. Now to do this, you just need to click on any one of these patterns and voila, the pattern will pop in. And there are different like thicknesses and all of that, that's there. Now your next question might be, well, it's going the opposite way. You know, if you want to get it going the same way, then they're probably closer. Then you really need to affect the scale of this pattern. Now Illustrator does have a scale tool, which is located here. And the scale tool is used to scale anything, objects, line work. And if we're going to use the scale tool, however, when you click on the scale tool, it's essentially going to allow you to scale whatever object you have selected. Now, we don't want to scale this object, definitely. See, we don't want to mess with that, definitely. So I'm going to undo this. We don't want to scale the object. What we want to scale is the pattern inside the object. Now, in order to do this, to access options for this tool, you would need to double click the scale button. Now, when you double click the scale button, you want to ensure that corners and scale, stroke, and effects are turned off. You also want to not scale the object. The only thing you want to scale is the pattern. And that is the trick to using the scale tool, right? So I am going to uncheck that, and I'm only going to check that. Now I'm going to also check the preview so that I can see what's happening here. And if I mouse wheel here, you can see that I'm actually scaling just the pattern. Now, of course, if I was scaling all of this, then you would see the entire thing scale up or scale down. But we don't want to scale the corners, the strokes, or the object. We just want to scale the patterns. Now, the next thing that we want to do, let's make that a little maybe smaller. The next thing we want to do is to perhaps change the direction of the scale. Well, to do that, then we'll just go to the rotate tool, which is located here. And we're going to repeat the same process again. We're going to double click the rotate tool. And we're going to say we only want to scale the pattern. We don't want to scale the object. Sorry, we only want to rotate the pattern, not the object. And we do want to preview what we are doing. So we are going to now use the mouse wheel again and move this around. There we go. And we're going to choose OK. All right, so that is pretty much it. So now all we need to do is apply this over here. Now we can use the pipette tool once again. I do believe we can select this object here, use the pipette tool, and just click this object here, and voila. Now what about the ground? Now obviously the ground has some patterns, but it's definitely not line work. It's more like dots. So we would need to turn back to our swatches panel here. We need to go back to our library, which is located here. And then we need to go to patterns, and this time we can maybe go to graphic dots. Now notice you're going to get these dots here. Now with the object selected, again, make sure that you have the fill that's highlighted because you want to fill this object. You don't want to change the stroke. And yes, you can apply a pattern to a stroke. So you want to make sure that the fill is what is highlighted there. And with that selected, then let's select one of these patterns here, maybe like that. And I think that is good enough. We can even add patterns to multiple objects. So we can select that, hold shift, select that, and then select the same pattern. Oh, there we go. There we go. All right, so now with that done, we can turn off the background layer, and you see that we now have a vector sketch of this sketch interpretation. Now the greatest thing about having something as a vector is that you can now go in and change things like the color of the fill, or Maybe you want to change like the direction of the arrows. It is way easier to just manipulate these lines than to try and edit it as a vector. You know, if you don't want something to be there, you just edit it. So this has a lot of flexibility once you manually convert something to a vector. So this ends the exercise 3 of using a vector editing software.